My name is Crispin Pailing and I'm rector of Liverpool. I'm standing outside Liverpool Parish Church, which has been a place of worship since the 13th century. There's been a building on this site, on the same slightly quirky angle when you look at the maps, since that time. It hasn't been the same building, and it began with the Chapel of St Mary del Quay, which will have been closer to the river over there. By the 14th century, the Chapel of St Nicholas was built, and we'll explore that in just a moment. This is the most historic part of the city remaining. This is the only building in Liverpool which has been on the same site and in the same use for so many years. And we're going to explore in the rest of this short segment just how that started and what's left of those early medieval remains. There are many hidden parts of this building, both above ground and also underground. And here we're going to go into the boiler cellar, which contains some of the oldest bits of masonry connected to this building. And we're going to see what we can see. It's a place we don't go very often, and there are all sorts of things that move about uninvited with four legs to make you scream. Inside the boiler cellar, it looks like a fairly modern building with some modern bricks, but actually if you look more closely you'll find a lot older bricks and masonry here, and they're layered up. You can almost excavate the building by looking at the bricks alone. Back in 2018 I invited archaeologists from the Museum of Liverpool to come and explore down here and see what they could find about the history of this site. It's not just the bricks there, but as we move round here we can see some much older masonry here, and you can see the marks on the masonry where it's been dressed by tools, hand tools, no modern machinery there. And these little bits of older masonry remind us of the previous buildings on this site. This conjectural drawing by William Herdman was published in the 19th century. After the foundation of Liverpool by royal charter in 1207, it seems likely that from the earliest possible moment there was a garrison chapel in the castle, which stood where the monument to Queen Victoria now stands in Derby Square, outside the law courts. However, the townspeople will have needed somewhere to worship, and at some point in those early years, a chapel dedicated to St Mary of the Quay was erected. This manuscript from the 1250s is a property conveyance, which gives our first documentary evidence of the chapel in Liverpool. A parcel of land is referred to as being next to the chapel. Furthermore, the conveyance is witnessed by Richard, the chaplain, the earliest of my predecessors to whom we can give a name. A century later, the growth of the town meant that the small chapel was insufficient in both size and dignity. The new chapel of St Nicholas was built, and this entry in the register of Robert Stretton, Bishop of Chester, records the commission for the dedication of the new chapel in Liverpool in February 1361. The archaeological survey which we commissioned in 2018 mapped and recorded the masonry under the church. The bricks which we saw around the doorway are 18th century and were possibly connected to a secular building on the same site and adjoining the church. The fact that the wall is now obviously truncated suggests that it played a more significant part in a building other than the church. More interesting is the masonry on this wall, which is directly underneath the tower, and it is these large masonry blocks which complete the picture for us as we explore the origins of the first buildings on this site. Here in the basement of the building we've got the history of the church arrayed, not just with modern things such as the parish barbecue here, but also the foundations of the tower. Back in 1810, the then tower collapsed. It had stood for some hundreds of years, and in the 1740s a spire had been put on it, which was perhaps the tipping point in what happened. But it was some decades later when one morning in February 1810 people were coming into church, and at the head of it all was the procession of children from the local charity school. the boys were behind and the girls were coming in 2 by 2, and the bell ringers were ringing. Needless to say, the clergy were nowhere near the building at this point because the service wasn't going to begin for some time, so they were still on the other side of the churchyard. But the bell ringers noticed that the stones were beginning to move and to tumble, and they ran. They all survived. But as the spire came down and took with it the roof of the nave and the west gallery, and then the stones fell on children as they came in. About 25 children died that day. Most of them were girls. This tragedy affected the city, but then of course the church had to look at the practical side of rebuilding. And they got some engineers in and some structural engineers to look at what happened. And the first one said, well, clearly the foundations were not firm, and so the vestry at the time, the church warden, thought, well, it's a point of view, but it sounds like an expensive point of view. So they got someone else in who said, no, it's all fine. All you've got to do is build it up again. This seemed to be a much more pragmatic approach. And so they just built some new foundations, and they built the tower, which, to be fair, still stands today. But when we look at the foundations of the tower, the stone used from the earlier building as it fell, they put in bits of rough stone here and there. And in the midst of it all, we can see this piece of dressed stone. And this is probably from the earlier building. It's certainly medieval dressed stone. And in this city, which has wiped away its medieval footprint, this in the city centre could be the only piece of medieval Liverpool that is still able to be seen.